My husband insulted my family, saying I came from nothing. His face turned ghostly white when my father's private jet landed, carrying a team of lawyers ready to take back everything he thought he owned. It happened so quickly. One moment we were all laughing around the dinner table, the rich aroma of roasted chicken filling the air, and the next Charles had me in his sights. I had always known he had a sharp tongue, but I had never imagined it could cut so deeply. The evening had started innocently enough. It was a family gathering, a rare moment where we all came together, sharing stories and catching up. His parents, my parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone was there. The air was light, filled with chatter and laughter, and I should have felt at ease. But something about the way Charles had been glancing at me all night told me something wasn't right. He had this smirk on his face that I couldn't quite place, an edge to his smile that made my stomach churn. We were all seated at the long table with plates full of food in front of us. Charles had been talking about a new business deal, one he was proud of, boasting about how it would take him to the next level. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift. Somehow it always came back to me, my family, my background. "Well, Sarah," Charles said, leaning back in his chair with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, "it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I've got all these grand plans and then there's you, just a girl who came from nothing." I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at him, unsure if the words I heard were real. He didn't stop there. "I mean, come on. Look at your family. You know, nobodies, just regular folks, huh? It's almost cute how they pretend they're something." My hands clenched under the table and I could feel my chest tighten, but I refused to let the anger rise to my face. I couldn't let him see how much his words hurt me. I took a deep breath, focusing on the conversation around me, but the mocking tone, the ridicule, it stuck with me. I glanced around the table, half expecting someone to speak up, to defend me, but everyone stayed silent. No one wanted to cross Charles, the man of the hour, the one who seemed to have it all. I felt small, insignificant. My mind was racing. How could he say something like that? I had worked so hard to be where I was, yet here I was, being reduced to nothing in front of everyone. But the worst part? He said it with such ease, like it was just another joke, a harmless jab. It wasn't the first time I'd felt his superiority, but this was different. It was a deliberate strike aimed directly at my heart. I wanted to scream at him, to throw my plate across the room, to tell him how wrong he was, how he didn't know a damn thing about my family or me. But instead I swallowed hard, my eyes stinging with the beginning of tears I refused to shed. I excused myself from the table, walking away before I could say something I'd regret. I found myself standing alone in the living room, leaning against the cold window, staring outside into the night. The streets below were quiet, peaceful, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing inside me. My reflection in the glass looked back at me and I barely recognized the woman staring back. She was hurt, angry, broken in some way. I wanted to shatter the reflection, but instead I stood there letting the tears fall. How could he say those things to me about my family? My parents worked their entire lives, struggling to give me the opportunities one had. They weren't wealthy, they didn't have fancy titles or a luxurious lifestyle, but they had love. They had strength. And that was something Charles would never understand. But then something inside me shifted. I didn't want to be this weak, hurt woman. I was more than what he thought of me. I had been raised by parents who showed me the value of hard work, integrity, and loyalty. If Charles didn't see that, then he didn't deserve a place in my life. I wasn't going to let him define who I was. I wiped away the tears, a new resolve settling in my chest. No more. No more would I allow anyone, especially Charles, to make me feel small. I would show him. I would show him that I was capable of far more than he could ever imagine. The thought of revenge didn't come to me as a wave of anger. It was calm, calculated. I had the power to make him regret the moment he ever insulted me. I wasn't just a woman who came from nothing. I was Sarah, a woman with a family that loved me, a woman with a strength that Charles could never understand. And if he thought he could tear me down with words, he was mistaken. From that moment, I promised myself that I would make him pay for every hurtful word he'd ever said. I didn't know how, but I would make sure that Charles learned exactly who I was. And in the process I would show myself just how strong I truly was. The next time I saw him he wouldn't know what hit him. I couldn't shake the anger that had built up inside me as I sat in my room, staring out the window at the quiet night. Charles's words echoed in my mind like a loud drumbeat, each repetition making my blood boil just a little bit more. But as much as I wanted to focus on what had just happened, something kept nagging at me. There was this feeling, a sense of urgency, like I needed to understand more about my own life, my own history. I had always known my father, Robert, as a quiet man. He was a simple businessman, or so I thought. Growing up, we lived in a modest home and I never questioned how we lived. My mother often said, "We might not have money but we have love." And that's all that mattered to me. But tonight something inside me clicked. Charles had humiliated me not just for who I was but for where I came from. The weight of his words made me feel like I was nothing. But were they really true? Was I truly as insignificant as he made me feel? I needed to know more about my father, about my family. If I was going to take control of this situation, I had to understand where I came from. Maybe it was time to look deeper into things I had ignored or brushed aside for years. The next morning, I found myself going through old family records, letters, and anything that could give me a clue about my father's past. I pulled out old photo albums, flipping through yellowed pages filled with memories. There was one photograph that caught my eye. My father standing next to a man I didn't recognize. They were shaking hands, their smiles wide, but something about the way they looked in that picture struck me. The man beside my father wasn't just anyone. I didn't know it yet, but this man was about to open my eyes to a truth that would change everything. I called my mother, trying to stay calm as I asked her about the photograph. She hesitated and I could hear the change in her voice. "Sarah, you don't need to worry about that man. Your father, he's always been a private person," she said, her tone unusually guarded. I pushed further. "Mom, I need to know. Who is he?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, she sighed. "I think it's time you know the truth. Your father is more than what he's let on. He's a very private man, but he's not just a businessman. He's involved in some very powerful circles." I felt a chill run down my spine. The world I thought I knew, the life I thought I understood, was unraveling before me. My father, the quiet, modest man who had always been a background figure, was far more than I ever imagined. I pressed her for more details, but she told me that my father had always kept his wealth hidden, that he preferred to remain out of the public eye. It wasn't until later, much later, that I would understand just how far his reach really extended. After the call ended, I sat there in stunned silence. My mind raced with questions. Why had my father kept this secret? Was I living a lie all these years? Had Charles been right? I felt lost, unsure of where to go next. But my mother's cryptic words kept haunting me. My father had always kept an eye on things, but now I was starting to realize just how closely he had been watching me. I dug deeper into my father's past, and the more I learned, the more my world shifted. My father's name wasn't just known in business circles. It was known internationally. He had investments in companies all over the world, owned properties in countries I had never even been to, and had connections that reached the highest levels of government. His private jet wasn't just for luxury. It was a tool to move him, and those he protected, in and out of situations no one else could even dream of navigating. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that my father had always been there, watching over me in ways I never knew. He had known about Charles even before I did. He had known about the way Charles treated me, the way he belittled my family. And he had done nothing to stop it until now. As the pieces began to fall into place, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. This was my family. This was my heritage, and it was so much more than I ever realized. I wasn't just a girl from nothing, as Charles had so carelessly put it. I had a legacy, one that stretched far beyond what anyone, especially Charles, could ever imagine. The realization hit me hard. My father had known everything. He had seen the way I had struggled, seen how Charles treated me. But instead of stepping in, he had waited. He had waited for the right moment, and now I knew why. This moment, this insult, this humiliation, was the trigger. It was his way of showing me that I wasn't powerless. I had always had the power within me, but now I had the knowledge to back it up. My next move was clear. I had no intention of letting Charles get away with what he had said. But I wasn't going to confront him head-on. That wasn't the way. I wasn't going to let him see the anger on my face. Instead, I was going to make sure that when the time came, it would be him who was left stunned, left powerless. And it wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about reclaiming who I was. About proving to myself that I wasn't just some girl from nothing. I was Sarah, my father's daughter, with a legacy that demanded respect. I wasn't going to allow Charles to belittle me any longer. I closed my eyes, imagining the day when everything would change. When the secrets my father had kept would finally come to light, and Charles would understand just how wrong he had been about me. About us. And so my journey began. Not just to confront Charles, but to reclaim everything I had lost in that single moment. I wasn't just fighting for revenge, I was fighting for my own identity, my own strength. As I prepared for the next step, I knew one thing for sure. I was not who Charles thought I was. And soon he would learn that the hard way. The more I learned about my father's hidden life, the more I realized just how little I truly knew. It was like stepping into an entirely new world. One that had been right under my nose all this time. There was a weight to it, something heavy that settled in my chest. I had always thought of Robert as just my father. But now I saw him as something more. Something much larger than I could ever imagine. I spent the next few days buried in research, diving into every scrap of information I could find. I didn't want to leave any stone unturned. Every document I uncovered, every secret I exposed, added more layers to the mystery of my family. The truth was becoming clear. My father was not just a businessman. He was a man who had orchestrated an empire from the shadows. And I was a part of it, whether I knew it or not. But as the puzzle pieces fell into place, something else struck me. A deeper, more unsettling truth was beginning to emerge. If my father had been watching me all these years, then surely he knew everything about Charles. He had known what was happening behind closed doors, how Charles had been mocking my family, belittling me for my past. And he had done nothing. It wasn't that he hadn't cared. It was that he had chosen to stay in the background. Waiting. Watching. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, that my father had let me face the humiliation alone, or that he knew everything and had decided not to intervene, at least not until now. I sat in my room, staring at the documents scattered across the desk, feeling the weight of the decision I had to make. I was done being passive. I was done being the one who was always left to pick up the pieces. This was my life, my dignity, and I wasn't going to wait any longer. I wasn't just going to let my father handle it. It was time for me to take control. As I sat there lost in thought, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unfamiliar number, but something inside me told me to answer it. I picked up, and before I could say anything, a calm voice on the other end spoke. "Miss Sarah," the voice said, its tone steady and professional, "this is Agent Wallace. I've been assigned by your father to ensure your safety and well-being. I believe you're aware of the situation regarding your husband." My heart skipped a beat. My father had been watching me. All this time. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" "The insult at the dinner table," Agent Wallace continued. "We've been keeping track of your husband's actions and we've seen enough. It's time to take action." A chill ran down my spine. This was real. It wasn't just about me anymore. My father had seen everything and now he was going to act. "Your father has already made arrangements," Wallace said. "We're ready to move forward. We have the resources, the legal support, and the evidence needed. We're going to make sure your husband understands the consequences of his actions." I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, excitement, and fear. The revenge I had been fantasizing about was finally within my reach, but it wasn't just mine to carry out anymore. It wasn't just my anger that was driving this, it was my father's power, his legacy, and his will. I had a new sense of purpose now and I was ready to see it through. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Trust us," Wallace said. "Everything is already in motion. You don't need to worry about anything. Just stay where you are and we'll take care of the rest." I set the phone down, my heart racing. Everything had just changed. My life, my relationship, my entire sense of self. All of it was shifting in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was someone with power, with a history, and with the means to reshape my future. I spent the next few hours pacing around my house, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My mind spun with thoughts of Charles. The way he had humiliated me, the way he had treated my family. He thought he could control me. He thought he could belittle me. But he had no idea who I really was. I wasn't just his wife, some insignificant woman who didn't matter. I was Robert's daughter, someone who had a legacy. Someone who would not be pushed around. I felt the anger and hurt that I had been holding on to for so long bubbling up inside me again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the frustration of being belittled. It was the drive of someone who was about to take everything back. I wasn't going to let Charles win. I wasn't going to let him get away with making me feel like nothing. As the hours passed, I began to hear the distant hum of a jet flying overhead. My heart raced. I knew what was happening. I knew that my father's private jet had arrived and with it a team of lawyers. A team that would bring everything crashing down around Charles. The jet landed not far from my house, and I felt a sense of inevitability wash over me. This was happening. There was no turning back now. I stood by the window, watching as the team of lawyers gathered their documents and prepared to descend on Charles. I couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and unease. This was everything I had wanted. And yet, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was stepping into a world I hadn't fully prepared for. My father's empire was vast, and I was only just beginning to understand the true extent of it. But I couldn't let myself doubt now. This was the moment I had been waiting for. And as I watched the lawyers leave for Charles's office, I knew that everything was about to change. My life was no longer defined by his insults. My life was mine to control, and I wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Charles, take that from me again. The morning after the call from Agent Wallace felt like the calm before the storm. I had spent the night wide awake, my thoughts swirling like a never-ending storm. Now, as daylight broke through my bedroom window, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. My father's private jet had landed, bringing with it a team of lawyers who were prepared to dismantle Charles's empire. I could feel the intensity building inside me. The plan was in motion, and soon, Charles would realize that he had messed with the wrong person. As I walked through the house, I felt the weight of what was about to happen. I had never imagined that my life would take such a dramatic turn. But in some ways I was relieved. The anger that had been building inside me for so long was finally being directed towards something. I was no longer just a passive victim in my own life. I was part of something bigger, something powerful, and I had the chance to fight back. I glanced at my phone. There was a message from Agent Wallace. "We're ready to move forward. Just stay calm and trust that we've got everything covered. The legal team is already in motion." I took a deep breath and steadied myself. There was no turning back now. I had to trust them. I had to trust my father, even if part of me felt conflicted about everything he had done. Or rather not done, until now. It didn't matter. I was here now, standing at the edge of a new life, and I couldn't afford to look back. The next few hours were a blur. I received another message from Wallace, this time detailing Charles's schedule for the day. The lawyers were going to intercept him during his meeting at his office. It was all meticulously planned out. I couldn't help but be amazed at how much thought and effort had been put into this. Everything was falling into place. I imagined what Charles would be feeling right now. Probably too arrogant to even consider the possibility of what was coming. He had always thought he was untouchable. But he was wrong. I spent the next few hours pacing the house, trying to calm my nerves. The air felt thick, like something electric was charging the atmosphere. The doorbell rang and my heart jumped in my chest. I quickly opened the door to find a black SUV parked in front of the house. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, a briefcase in hand. "Miss Sarah," he said with a slight nod, introducing himself as one of my father's legal representatives. "We're ready to proceed. Are you prepared?" I nodded, feeling a wave of both relief and anxiety wash over me. "I'm ready." We drove to Charles's office, the SUV moving through the city streets with an almost eerie precision. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of putting up with Charles's arrogance, the countless times he belittled me, the constant reminder that my past meant nothing to him. But all of that was about to change. When we arrived at Charles's office, I waited in the car while the legal team went inside. They didn't need me yet. I could only imagine how Charles would react when the team presented him with the evidence they had collected. It was time for him to understand that his empire wasn't as solid as he thought. I felt my pulse quicken as I waited, every minute stretching longer than the last. What was happening inside? I couldn't wait any longer. I texted Wallace asking for an update. The reply came quickly, "Everything's going as planned. He's been served with the first set of documents. He's furious, but he's trying to play it off as if it's nothing." I sat back in the seat, gripping the edge of the car door. I knew Charles. I knew how he could be when things weren't going his way. The arrogance in his voice would likely turn to panic as soon as the legal team started presenting their evidence. The man who thought he could control everything, manipulate everyone, was about to face the truth he had been trying to avoid. Minutes later, the car door opened. One of the lawyers stepped inside, his face unreadable. "It's time," he said quietly. I nodded and followed him out of the car, my heels clicking against the pavement. Inside, Charles's office was as pristine as always, the glass walls offering a view of the city below. Charles was sitting behind his massive desk, his posture stiff, his face a mask of irritation. When he saw me walk in, his eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. The lawyer stepped forward, holding a stack of documents. "Mr. Collins," he began, his voice calm and authoritative, "we're here to present evidence regarding your business dealings, specifically in relation to some questionable financial practices and legal violations." Charles's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he quickly recovered, his bravado returning. "This is a joke," he scoffed. "You think you can intimidate me with a few papers? I don't have time for this." But the lawyer continued, "We also have information about your offshore accounts, the shell companies you've been using to launder money, and the illegal transactions that have been going on under your watch. We've got everything, proof, witnesses, and records that tie you to several criminal activities." The color drained from Charles's face as the words hit him one after another. His mouth opened but no sound came out. He looked at me then, his eyes flashing with disbelief. "You," he said hoarsely, "you did this." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I watched as the truth hit him like a freight train, the weight of his own lies crashing down on him. His empire, the one he had built through deceit and manipulation, was starting to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I suggest we go over these documents in detail, Mr. Collins," the lawyer said, his tone unwavering. Charles looked at him, then at me, and finally he sank back into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time I saw fear in Charles's eyes. It was a strange, satisfying feeling. This was what he deserved. This was the consequence of treating me like I didn't matter, of thinking he could tear down everything that made me who I was. But even as I watched Charles fall apart, a part of me felt hollow. This wasn't just about seeing him lose everything. It was about my own redemption. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but I didn't want it to come at the cost of losing myself in the process. I had reclaimed my power, but I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. As the lawyers continued their work, I stepped back and let the weight of the moment settle over me. I had taken the first step, but there was still a long way to go. This wasn't just the end of Charles. It was the beginning of a new chapter for me. A chapter where I would no longer be the passive one. A chapter where I would stand tall, no longer defined by anyone else's standards. I stood in the corner of Charles's sleek, glass-walled office, my hands shaking slightly as I watched the scene unfold in front of me. I could barely contain the excitement and the nerves that had been building up for weeks. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Charles was no longer in control. His empire, built on arrogance and manipulation, was crumbling piece by piece right in front of him. The legal team had already laid out their case. The documents, the evidence, the phone calls, they had everything. But it wasn't just about the paperwork anymore. It was about proving that I wasn't some insignificant woman from nowhere. I wasn't the person Charles had tried to make me feel like. I had a legacy, a powerful one, and it was time for him to understand that. I watched as Charles, his face slowly turning from shock to disbelief, flipped through the pages of the legal documents in front of him. His hands trembled, the arrogance he'd worn so confidently like a cloak for years slipping away with every new piece of evidence presented. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the realization that he was completely out of his depth. This wasn't something he could buy his way out of. This wasn't something his charm or money could fix. For a moment, I felt a strange surge of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by a dull ache deep inside me. This wasn't just about making him pay for the things he'd done to me. It was about showing myself that I had the strength to stand up for what was mine. But the price of this power, the toll it had taken on me emotionally, wasn't lost on me. As the lawyers continued their work, I found my thoughts drifting to the man who had orchestrated all of this. My father. Robert. He was the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes, the one whose influence had made this entire operation possible. I had never imagined that the quiet, stoic figure I had always known as my father was actually a man with such a vast empire, someone who had connections and power beyond anything I had ever fathomed. It wasn't just his wealth that had shocked me. It was the fact that he had been watching over me all these years, making sure I was never truly alone. He had seen the way Charles had treated me, and he had known that it would take more than just words to make things right. He knew that the only way to bring me justice was to hit Charles where it hurt the most. His wealth, his reputation, and his power. And now he was doing just that. But still there was something unsettling about it. The fact that my father had been silently watching me from the shadows, letting me deal with the emotional scars that Charles had left, made me question everything. Had he been waiting for this moment? Had he known that Charles would cross a line that would finally make him act? Or was this simply how my father operated? Always a step ahead, never letting anyone see his true intentions? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about revenge for the insults, the humiliations, or even the years of feeling powerless. It was about something bigger. About the forces that shaped my life without me even realizing it. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was part of something that had been building for years, something much larger than my small world with Charles. The door to the office swung open suddenly, and I turned to see two more lawyers entering the room, their faces unreadable. They were followed by one of my father's trusted men, Agent Wallace. His eyes locked with mine for a split second before he turned to Charles, who was still fumbling with the papers in front of him. "Mr. Collins," Wallace's voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that made Charles freeze. "It's clear that you've tried to conceal a lot of things from the public and the authorities. Your actions have been under investigation for quite some time, and now the full extent of your illegal dealings is exposed." Charles looked at Wallace, his face paling even further. His mouth opened but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he was drowning in a sea of his own making. For once I saw him as weak. A man who had spent so long pretending to be untouchable that he had forgotten that the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Wallace continued, "You've been served with a court order to freeze your assets. All accounts, properties, and investments will be reviewed. If any of these are found to be involved in illegal activities, they will be seized and further legal action will be taken." Charles's eyes flickered to me as if he was trying to make sense of what was happening. I stood still, not saying a word, my gaze steady on him. He had humiliated me once, but now the tables had turned. He had no idea what it felt like to be on the receiving end of this kind of power. For a moment he seemed to gather himself. "You can't do this," he said, his voice shaky but filled with an underlying defiance. "You think you can just take everything from me because of a few accusations? You have nothing." But Wallace wasn't fazed. "We have everything we need, Mr. Collins. Your empire is built on lies. The truth has a way of coming out, and you're learning that now." As Charles sat there, his face contorting with anger and fear, I felt a strange sense of release. This was the justice I had wanted, the moment I had longed for. And yet there was a part of me that felt hollow. Watching him unravel didn't bring me the satisfaction I had imagined. It didn't erase the years of pain, the feeling of being small and worthless. But it did give me something far more valuable, a sense of closure. This wasn't just about tearing Charles down. It was about understanding that I was no longer bound by the fear and hurt he had inflicted. I wasn't the woman who had quietly accepted the insults and abuses. I had power now, not just from my father's influence, but from the realization that I was capable of more than I had ever thought. As the legal team worked to seal the documents and prepare for the next steps, I took a deep breath, knowing that this was only the beginning. I wasn't just reclaiming what had been taken from me. I was building something new, something of my own. Charles was broken and there was nothing left for him to cling to. But for me, this was the start of something different. The woman who had once been too afraid to speak up, too afraid to stand her ground, was finally free. And I couldn't wait to see where this new path would take me. I watched as Charles's face shifted from disbelief to panic, his usually confident demeanor slipping away with every word the lawyers spoke. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating even, and every inch of me wanted to scream. Not with rage, but with satisfaction, with vindication. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when everything he had taken from me would come crashing down, and there was no escape for him. But still, despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a strange, uneasy calm settling over me. Was this really justice? Was this really what I wanted? To see the man I had loved, the man I had trusted, reduced to nothing? My heart fluttered with a mix of exhilaration and guilt. There was a part of me that didn't want him to break entirely. But then I remembered his words, the way he had mocked me, my family, everything I stood for. He deserved this. He had to. I stood still in the background, trying to blend into the shadows of the office, watching him slowly sink into his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room as the weight of the documents, of the reality he couldn't escape, settled in. The lawyers were methodical, each one presenting their findings with unwavering calmness, as though they were merely stating facts. But these facts, these truths were his downfall, and he knew it. "Mr. Collins," one of the lawyers began, his voice unwavering, "we have documents that trace your offshore accounts, the illegal transactions you've conducted under false names, and several fraudulent deals that have been funneled through your business. We also have corroborating evidence from former associates, some of whom are willing to testify against you." Charles stiffened at the mention of witnesses. His mouth opened but no words came out. His gaze flickered to me once more, then back to the lawyers who were laying the trap he had built for himself. The walls were closing in on him. I could see it in his eyes, his mind was racing, trying to figure out a way out of this. But there was no escape. "Not this time. You're making a mistake," Charles finally said, his voice shaking but trying to mask the panic. "This is all fabricated. You can't just—" "It's not fabricated, Mr. Collins," the lawyer interrupted. "We've already checked everything. Your signature, the dates, the transactions, all of it matches perfectly with the financial records we've obtained." He looked at me again, this time with a deeper sense of dread. "You knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You planned this with your father, didn't you? This was all you." There was a brief flash of recognition, a flicker of realization in his eyes. He had underestimated me, thinking I was just the woman who had been too quiet, too passive. But I wasn't. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was so much more. "I didn't do this alone," I replied, my voice steady but carrying the weight of everything I had kept bottled up for so long. "But I knew what had to be done. You crossed a line, Charles, and now you'll face the consequences." I watched as he tried to find something, anything, to hold on to, but there was nothing left for him. The truth had already found him, and now there was no turning back. I couldn't feel sorry for him anymore. He had done enough to me, enough to my family. This was the price he had to pay. The lawyer continued, his words cutting through the thick silence. "We've also filed for the freezing of your assets, effective immediately. Your bank accounts, your investments, they're all under scrutiny now. Everything you've built is being dismantled, Mr. Collins." I saw Charles clench his fists, his knuckles turning white. His breath came faster now, and I could hear the desperation in his voice as he stammered. "This isn't over. You don't know who I am. I can fix this. I can." But his voice trailed off as the lawyer handed him another stack of papers. Charles took them, his hand shaking. He scanned through them, his eyes growing wider with each page he turned. Finally he looked up, defeated. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I'll pay, okay? I'll give you everything. Just don't destroy me." I stood there, frozen in place, a deep, almost suffocating silence filling the room. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt like this was the moment of my triumph, my justice. But instead a strange emptiness gnawed at me. Was this really what I wanted? To break him completely? To reduce him to nothing? I realized then that it wasn't about destroying him. It wasn't about making him feel the way he had made me feel. It was about reclaiming my own power, my own self-worth. I had let him define me for too long, letting his insults and arrogance chip away at my confidence. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about taking back control of my life. "Charles," I said, my voice softer than I expected, "this isn't just about you. It's about me. About what you did to me, to my family. I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done being the person you thought you could walk all over. You're right. You can't fix this. It's too late." I could see the change in him as the realization hit him, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of his power, was now nothing more than a shell of the person he used to be. It was heartbreaking in a way. But it wasn't enough for me to feel any sympathy. It wasn't enough for me to want to help him. His empire had been built on lies and manipulation, and now it was falling apart. His wealth, his influence, the control he had used to belittle me, it was all slipping through his fingers like sand. And it was all because he thought I was weak. He thought I was just some woman to be ignored and pushed around. But he was wrong. As the lawyers continued their work, Charles finally stood up, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You haven't won. You don't know what I can do. You think you're safe, but you're not. I'll make sure you regret this. I took a step forward, not backing down. You can try, Charles. But it's over. You're finished. The lawyers finished their work and stood ready to leave. I could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was free. Finally, truly free. As the final documents were signed and the weight of his fate pressed upon him, Charles sat in silence. The room was heavy with the aftermath of his crumbling empire, but I couldn't bring myself to feel anything for him. Not sympathy, not regret. The man who had once been the center of my world was now nothing but a shell of himself. And it wasn't just his wealth that had been stripped away. It was everything. His arrogance, his confidence, the very foundation of his identity. I stood across the room watching him as he slumped in his chair, his face pale, his eyes filled with disbelief. For a moment he looked lost, like a man who had woken up from a dream only to realize that everything he had built was nothing more than a mirage. His world had always been about power, about control, about making everyone around him feel small. And now it was slipping through his fingers. For years I had lived in his shadow, uncertain of my place in his world. I had allowed him to diminish me, to mock my family, my past. And for what? To be a part of his world. To be part of a game where the rules were always stacked against me? Not anymore. I was done playing by his rules. I was done being the woman who quietly accepted his cruel jabs and belittling remarks. Charles tried to stand, but his legs wavered beneath him. He caught himself on the edge of his desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. I watched him, impassive, my heart no longer caught in the web of his manipulation. This wasn't about watching him suffer. It was about reclaiming my own strength, about standing on my own 2 feet for the first time in years. "Sarah, please," Charles whispered, his voice barely audible, almost pleading. "I didn't mean it. I was wrong. I was just angry. You know how I get." His words were desperate, his pride crumbling like the empire he had so carefully constructed. I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I watched him squirm, the man who had once held such power over me reduced to nothing more than a broken man clinging to whatever shred of dignity he had left. It was strange, almost surreal to see him like this. The man who had made me feel like nothing was now the one who felt small. The roles had reversed, and for once, it was clear who held the power. "You never understood me, Charles," I finally said, my voice steady but carrying a weight I had never allowed myself to express before. "You always thought I was just someone to be controlled, someone to be used. You never saw me for who I truly am. And now you're paying the price for that." He flinched at my words, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and shame. I could see him struggling to find the words to salvage the situation, to beg for forgiveness. But the truth had already settled between us like an unspoken barrier. The damage was done, and no amount of begging could undo the years of torment, of belittlement, of being treated like I was less than him. "I don't want your apology," I said, my voice firm. "I want you to face the consequences of your actions. You've been given every opportunity to do the right thing, but you chose to hurt people. And now you're going to have to live with that." Charles looked at me, his eyes searching mine as though he was waiting for some kind of sign, some indication that I would take pity on him. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't the woman who would silently endure his cruelty. I wasn't the woman who would keep forgiving him just because he smiled and said the right words when he needed something from me. No, this was different. This time I was the one who held the power. This time I was the one who was in control of my own destiny. "Don't you get it, Charles?" I asked quietly, taking a step closer to him. "You ruined everything. Not just for me but for yourself. You thought you could control me, control everyone around you, but in the end you were just running from the truth. And now it's caught up with you." His shoulders sagged in defeat, and for the first time I saw the man who had once been so confident, so full of pride, become just another human being, vulnerable and broken. I realized then that this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at him for all the ways he had hurt me. It was about recognizing my own strength, my own worth. This was my moment to stand tall and say, "I'm not going to let you hurt me anymore." The silence between us was deafening as I stood there, watching the man who had once made me feel so small now reduced to a shadow of his former self. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt liberated. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, a burden I hadn't even realized I had been carrying. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "What happens now, Sarah?" I paused for a moment, considering his question. What did happen now? What was next for me? The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time I felt like I had the power to shape it. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I wasn't someone who had to accept the life I had been given. I was someone who could choose. And that made all the difference. "What happens now," I said slowly, "is that I walk away from all of this. I'm leaving you behind, Charles. I'm moving on." He didn't respond, just sat there, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. I could see the fight drain out of him, the last of his pride withering away. And I realized that I wasn't just walking away from him. I was walking away from a version of myself that had allowed this to happen. I was walking away from the woman who had been afraid to speak up, afraid to stand up for herself. And I was stepping into a new version of me, one who was strong, independent, and no longer afraid. With one last glance at the man who had once been my world, I turned and walked out of the room, my footsteps steady and sure. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I knew that it was the closing of a chapter in my life that would never open again. I had taken back my power, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me ever again. The door closed softly behind me, but it felt like the whole world had shifted with that single click. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my back to the office, my mind still processing everything that had just happened. Charles, the man who had once held all the power in our relationship, the man who had made me feel so small, was now a broken shell of himself. The empire he had built was crumbling, and for the first time I felt a sense of freedom. But with that freedom came a strange emptiness, as though a part of me was missing. I leaned against the wall, staring at the polished floor, the sound of my own breath in the stillness of the hallway almost deafening. What now? What did I do with this newfound power, with this sense of self that had emerged from the ashes of everything I had endured? For so long I had defined myself by my relationship with Charles. I had been the wife, the support, the one who quietly endured. But now that role was gone. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was something more. But what? My mind flashed back to the early days of our relationship, when everything had seemed so perfect. Charles had charmed me with his confidence, his ambition, his belief that we could conquer the world together. But somewhere along the way, that charm had turned into manipulation, and his ambition had twisted into something ugly. The man who had once promised me the world had made me feel like I wasn't worth anything. But now I had taken back control. I had walked away. And as I stood there in the hallway, I realized that this was my chance to finally start living for myself. To create a life that was mine, not defined by the man I had once loved, not defined by anyone else's expectations. It was time to build a future that was true to who I was. A future where I was the one calling the shots, where I was the one in control. I could feel the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. There was no turning back now. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that office hours ago. I wasn't the same woman who had stayed silent, who had allowed herself to be pushed around. I had found something inside myself, something strong, something unshakable, and now it was time to live it. I took a deep breath, letting the silence wash over me for a moment longer. The world outside was still, peaceful, but inside, everything was moving. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going back. I wasn't going to let the past define me any longer. As I made my way toward the exit, I found myself walking with purpose. My steps were steady, firm, and as I pushed open the door and stepped out into the daylight, I felt the warmth of the sun on my face. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I had taken back control of my life, and no one, not Charles, not anyone, could take that away from me. The city around me seemed to hum with possibilities. There were so many things I wanted to do, so many places I wanted to go. But for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of someone else's expectations on my shoulders. I was finally free to chase my own dreams, to find out what I wanted from life. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for just a moment. There were so many people I needed to talk to. My parents, for one. I had so many questions about everything, about my father, about the legacy I had inherited, about what my future looked like now. But I couldn't reach out to them yet. Not until I had figured out who I was, not until I had taken the time to rebuild myself from the inside out. Instead, I called a friend A woman I had known for years but hadn't kept in touch with as much as I would have liked. We used to be close before everything with Charles had consumed me. I needed someone who would understand the journey I was on. The phone rang twice before she answered. Sarah? Her voice was surprised but warm. Is everything okay? I smiled, leaning against the cool glass of the building. Yeah, everything's fine, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in a long time. Actually, I need a favor. Oh. He sounded curious now. What's up? I want to start over, I said, the words feeling both heavy and freeing. I want to do something for myself. I need some time away from everything. Away from this city, away from everything. Do you think you could help me find a place? There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft laugh. Of course. I know just the place. We'll make it happen. Just say when. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. A small step toward rebuilding my life. Toward creating a space where I could breathe, where I could figure out who I was, what I wanted, and how to get there. The conversation ended and I stood there for a long time, staring out at the busy streets, watching the world move around me. But for once, I wasn't rushing to catch up with it. I wasn't following anyone's lead. I was choosing my own path. As the days went on, I took small steps, gathering the pieces of my life that I had left behind, sorting through old memories and letting go of things that no longer served me. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when I'd question myself, when I'd wonder if I had made the right choice, when the loneliness would creep in and make me doubt my strength. But I also knew that this was my time. My chance to rebuild, to reshape my life into something that felt true to who I was. I didn't need Charles to complete me. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. I had found that within myself. And as I moved forward, I knew that nothing, no one, could take that from me. The future was mine, and for the first time in a long time I felt excited for what was to come. I had walked away from the past, and now it was time to embrace the unknown. And I was ready. More than ready. If you've enjoyed this journey of empowerment, transformation, and justice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Stay tuned for more tales that will inspire, challenge, and captivate you. Your support means the world, so hit that subscribe button and be part of our growing community. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.